I'm Dave Dinkel, and this is a continuing video series of actual recent deals, and this is an example of a $9,260.40 profit on a simple $7,277 wholesale flip, no money whatsoever in the deal. The following is a real estate deal that was recently completed by us or a student, in this case a student. The deal exemplifies some of the various aspects of how to do these transactions. So not to embarrass anyone involved in this transaction, all parties have been kept anonymous. I'm not an attorney, a CPA, or a realtor, and any information derived from this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. Now this is an example of a double closing with the first leg of the A to B being done with a student using free transactional funding. And if you ask me how do they do that, it's very simple. This particular closing agent does an extraordinarily good job of recruiting new investors. What they do is they offer free transactional funding for deals less than $80,000. In this case, seller A, or the property owner, and this happened to be a probate, so it was the personal rep of the former property owner, sold to buyer B, the student, who then sells to buyer C, which in this case was an individual. The student got free transactional funding, so there was no money in the deal, required no credit because there was no conventional lender involved. There was no risk because there was no money of his in the deal. Again, as I said before, this particular closing agent gives free transactional fundings for deals less than $80,000 if they close both legs, A to B and B to C. I believe this is one of the greatest deals ever, showing the power of persistence. I love this when the students do it. This may seem like not a giant profit, or maybe not all that great, but it was done with no money, no credit, and no risk in the deal, as we always try to do. The really interesting part was that the property was listed for $39,000 originally, and the student made what he's supposed to do, a usual and ridiculously low offer of only $20,000. Happens to be 50% of the list price. That's not why he made that offer. What followed was a tongue and email lashing by the listing agent on how investors are stupid and on and on, and especially how the agent had multiple offers above $39,000. When we get that, I tell the students, just say, well, if you have multiple offers above $39,000, why is it still listed? Why don't you get it under contract? But the student held his ground, as he should have, and said he would track the property to see what happened, and that's exactly what he did. That's where we make our money, in the follow-up, not in making offers. If you're getting deals by making an offer, you're paying too much for us to wholesale the property once again. In a couple of months, the student checked the list price again and had been reduced to $18,000. Now remember, he offered $20,000. It's been reduced to below his offering price. The student called the agent, and the seller said they will not take a dime less than $18,000. Well, the student had offered $20,000 before, and the listing agent just forgot about it, apparently. Had the agent kept the first offer, the student would have paid $20,000. The student reoffered at $12,000, and of course, the seller was supposed to have said no. That was according to the agent. A little time went by, and the agent actually called the student and asked if his offer was still good. This is about 3 to 4 months after the first offer of $20,000. The student worked the agent and said he had looked further into the property and felt he had to reduce his offer to $6,000. Now, if the agent had other offers, he wouldn't be calling the student, so the student knew that he had him. The result was one mad agent who hung up on the student. 2 days later, the agent called back and said the $6,000 offer had been accepted. With a signed contract in hand from the seller, the student put out his bandit signs advertising his junker. Hate to refer to it as a junker, but it was an ugly house. He got a buyer for the property $18,000, but the buyer put a clause in his contract that seller has to deliver clear and marketable title at closing. While the property looks terrible, the lien search came back with no liens or code violations, so there were no title issues. What you're looking at now is the HUD closing statement for the A to B leg, the front page. As I usually do, I've taken out all the players and the information in it so no one's embarrassed in any way, shape, or form. The left side is always the buyer. In this case, it's the student. He's A. Here's the seller on the right side. Now, once again, I'll mention this, that the left side buyer is not called a buyer on the HUD statement. He's called a borrower, because typically the HUD statement was designed by Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to do conventional loans. So the borrower was always a buyer. However, not so in what we use it for, standard operating procedures to do closings. Second number on here is the transfer page 2 of the HUD. that has all the costs and expenses that the student or buyer is going to be paying. They amount to, it looks like $168. Apologize for the small size of the writing. This is a buyer contribution for taxes. That's what it says on the HUD statement. It turns out to be a debit to the buyer and a credit to the seller. Usually it's the other way around, but the student agreed to pay in this case. We'll see those on the next page. And there is the charge or debit to the student buyer. That's just the gross amount due to the seller. This is simply the settlement charges from the second page. This is the accrued taxes. They're going to be the same. And again, that's from the first of the year through the closing date. And then at the end of the year, whoever the owner is pays for the entire year. These are the property taxes, and they're debited. This next series of numbers are 2009 through 2012 property taxes, which were credited back to the seller at closing. So despite the fact that he sold the property for $6,000, his net that he received was $7,700 and change. Likewise, the student who purchased it for $6,000 wound up having to pay $7,277.99. Now this is page 2, and remember we had an agent involved in the transaction, so that was a listing agent for the seller, so his commission was paid from the seller's side. Doesn't have to be. It can be paid from the buyer's side. Anything on the HUD statement is negotiable except the amount of accrued taxes that are due, but the other party can pay them. Instead of the seller paying them, is typically the case through closing date, the buyer can say, I'll pay all the closing costs and include those as part of them. Now these are settlement charges. This one happens to be an abstract or title search. Here's notary fees, pretty stiff notary fees on the seller side. Typically a notary fee of this extent, $150, was usually an attorney. Now the student paid $100 for title insurance, $50 for overage on the title insurance. The seller paid a document prep fee, and the other $35 is a repository fee for track of the documents themselves. They're kept electronically. Here's some recording and transfer fees. Record the deed. Looks like the doc stamps for the transfer. Lien search is paid by the seller in this case. Doesn't have to be. The student was good enough to have those shifted even though he chose the closing agent. Everything is usual and customary. There's no legal, you have to do this, despite what you'll hear from sometimes a closing agent, an attorney, a seller, or anyone else. It's what's usual and customary, and anything is negotiable. Anything on the contract can be changed by simply adding an addendum. Now here's what's interesting. There's a $600 probate fees to the attorney. I think I mentioned before this is a probate. There's where the attorney got paid. So if the house had not been sold, the attorney would have gone after the estate or liened the property anyway to get paid. So the bottom line is this is what the seller's carry forward was to the first page. Here's what our student as the buyer's carry forward was, and you can see it's not a heck of a lot. Okay, so now here's where we make money or lose money. This is the HUD closing statement. B to C. In this case, the buyer is the end buyer. The buyer is C designate, and he's the one that's going to walk away with the property. There you can see paid $18,000. Student gets $18,000 credit to start. These are the closing fees brought over from the second page. I didn't show you on the first HUD, and I should have. Maybe I'll go back and show it to you. The student did exactly what he was supposed to do. He said to the end buyer, C, I want a deposit. He got a $5,000 deposit on an $18,000 purchase. What that meant is, as he got to closing, this is a double closing on the same day, had his end buyer, this guy C over here, decided not to come to closing, he would have made $5,000, but he would have lost his deposit. Now I'm going to go back and show you what his deposit was so you can see it. So here we are back on the closing statement for the A to B, page 1, and the deposit or earnest money deposit is right here. See how much that is? It's 0. Why is it 0? Because he didn't put one up. You say to yourself, well, gee, then he didn't have a valid contract. Well, if he didn't have a valid contract, he still made $9,000. Although you're absolutely right, I would say that in about 30 to 40% of our cases, the seller gets such a small deposit, he doesn't really care. In this case, he would have gotten probably $100 or $250 from our student anyway. So once again, here we are. Back on the B to C, and here's our closing or settlement cost from the page 2. Here's the accrued taxes once again. Now, This number should be exactly the same as the accrued taxes on the A to B side because they're done on the same day. You can check that if you're doing an A to B and B to C. Unless they're a different day, they're going to be the same thing. Sometimes when a transaction is delayed in closing, the closing agent just keeps the same HUD statement in effect, and even though every day that the seller holds it, it costs him money from accrued taxes, for example, end buyer doesn't really care because it doesn't make that much difference to him. However, sometimes, especially on very high priced homes, the guy may say, I want a new HUD, and it has to be changed. So there's the bottom line, if you can see it. It's $13,008 and change that the buyer had to bring in. He paid $18,000, but he put up a $5,000 deposit, so he brought in $13,000. Now here's the only number that counts for us. That's $16,538.39. That's the net proceeds to the student at the end of the day. We're going to go through page 2 just for a minute. I wanted to show you something up here. It was on the other page and I didn't mention it. It says POC. That means paid outside of closing. Typically what that is a seller or a buyer pays something that needs to be paid in cash in effect because they won't wait until the closing takes place and they can be paid off the HUD. A water bill, water bill may not be the perfect example, but sometimes to turn on the water for an inspection, the water bill has to be paid. So the end buyer goes down, initiates the payment, and then that payment is a credit to him at the closing, but it goes here as paid outside of closing. Okay, so here we are. This is a settlement fee to the end buyer, and the student pays the same thing. In this case, he paid for the lien search also. Abstract title. There's the title insurance coming up there. A wire fee, $50. Student's recording transfer charges. Again, the buyer is paying recording fees on their side. Student is paying tax stamps, silly little things. E-record. Now what the e-record is, in our state, the state has gone to electronic recording system. So what is now done is these documents are essentially scanned in electronically into the public record in a matter of seconds. Instead of sending someone down waiting at the clerk's desk and waiting for it to happen, anyone can do this. You don't have to be an attorney. You can get into their system, pay for it on an annual basis, and record your own documents. I have a few students that do that. Now they use it primarily to record notices of interest or memorandums of contracts to protect themselves. So here's the student's number. It looks like about $940. And there's what the buyer had to pay. Now again, those were all transferred to the front side of the closing statement. So here's the final result of the transaction. The student purchased the property off the MLS. It happened to have been a probate. It was a blind offer on a cheap property that had a retail value of about $45,000 to $50,000 as an after repaired value, or ARV. The student did what I call a rope-a-dope with a listing agent, whose commission went from potential of about $2,000 actually to $360 because he was trying to put on a sales job on the student about having multiple offers above listing and all those sorts of good things. Didn't work. Student used a bandit sign in the neighborhood to get a buyer to make an offer in a day after he signed the contract. Now the student's net profit for this no out-of-pocket money deal was $16,538 minus the $7,277. Net profit, bottom line, $9,260.40. The key here, no money, no credit, no risk in the deal. And he got the free money, transactional funding, by finding a closing agent that would fund the $7,277 that he needed for the closing. Thanks very much for joining us and have a great day.